Sometimes the door that closes in front of you is only there so the right person can notice you walking away. The words meant nothing to Ethan Walker that cold Tuesday morning as the heavy glass doors of Prairie State Bank shut behind him with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than every disappointment he had carried over the last 5 years. In one hand, he held a thin blue folder that had taken months to prepare. Tax records, repair estimates, business plans, every receipt carefully organized, every dream reduced to paper. In the other hand, he gripped the small lunchbox his 8-year-old daughter Lily had decorated with fading stickers of wildflowers and smiling suns. The loan officer had been polite. Too polite. She had folded her hands, offered an apologetic smile, and explained that the numbers simply did not support the risk. The farmhouse was too old. The land was too small. His income was too unpredictable. They admired his determination. They respected his work ethic, but respect could not approve alone. Ethan thanked her anyway. He always thanked people, even when they handed him disappointment. That was the kind of man he had become after losing almost everything except the one thing that mattered. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the late autumn wind carried the scent of dry cornfields and distant rain. Pickup trucks rolled slowly through the quiet main street. A flag above the courthouse fluttered against a pale gray sky. It looked like every other morning in the little farming town of Millbrook, Iowa. Yet to Ethan, the entire world suddenly felt unfamiliar. Without the loan, the overdue property taxes would catch up with him before winter ended. Without repairs, the aging farmhouse would not survive another season of freezing temperatures. Without the land, he would lose the only place where Lily still believed her mother somehow remained in every flower blooming beside the porch each spring. Ethan closed his eyes for only a second before forcing a small smile onto his face. Lily would be waiting after school, asking if everything had gone well. She deserved hope, not fear. She deserved bedtime stories, warm soup, and a father who never stopped believing tomorrow could be kinder than today. He slipped the folder beneath his arm and began the long walk toward his aging pickup truck parked 3 blocks away because he had not wanted to spend another $5 feeding the parking meter. Halfway down the sidewalk, he noticed an old farmer sitting quietly on a weathered wooden bench outside the feed supply store. The man wore faded denim overalls beneath a brown canvas jacket that had clearly seen decades of harvests. His white beard rested against his chest, and an old straw hat shaded thoughtful blue eyes that followed Ethan with calm curiosity rather than pity. The farmer did not wave. He did not speak. He simply watched as though he had been expecting this exact moment long before Ethan himself had arrived. Ethan offered the same polite nod he gave every stranger in town. The old man returned it almost imperceptibly before lowering his gaze toward the cracked leather gloves resting in his lap. Nothing about him seemed unusual. Just another aging farmer enjoying the cool morning air. Ethan kept walking, never realizing that someone had just witnessed the hardest moment of his life. Behind him, the old farmer slowly stood, picked up a worn wooden cane, and looked once more toward the struggling father disappearing down the sidewalk. His weathered face softened with the kind of expression only years of loss and quiet wisdom could create. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "Character always shows up before blessings do." Ethan never heard the words. He never looked back. And he certainly had no idea that the quiet farmer outside the bank had just made a decision that would change not only his future, but the future of everyone who would someday call that little farmhouse home. The old pickup groaned as Ethan Walker guided it along the narrow county road, its tires humming over cracked pavement lined with harvested cornfields that stretched toward the horizon like rows of quiet memories. The heater worked only when it wanted to, filling the cab with short bursts of warm air before falling silent again. But Lily never complained. She sat beside him with her backpack on her lap, carefully coloring a picture of their farmhouse beneath a bright yellow sun. "Do you think we will still have flowers next spring, Daddy?" she asked softly without looking up. Ethan kept his eyes on the road and smiled with a calmness he did not feel. "I think flowers are stubborn," he answered. "They always seem to find a reason to come back." Lily smiled, satisfied with the answer, and returned to her drawing. Ethan wished hope could be planted as easily as seeds. The farmhouse appeared at the end of a gravel driveway bordered by leaning fence posts and maple trees already stripped bare by autumn winds. Time had not been kind to the place. The porch sagged slightly on one side. The white paint had long surrendered to weather and age. A section of the barn roof waited patiently for repairs that never seemed to fit into the budget. Yet when Lily ran toward the front steps laughing because she spotted a pair of rabbits near the vegetable garden, Ethan could not imagine calling anywhere else home. He spent the afternoon replacing broken boards on a chicken coop using leftover lumber collected from demolition jobs around the county. Every nail mattered. Every scrap of wood found a purpose. As the sun drifted lower, Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow from the neighboring property, struggled to pull a heavy bag of livestock feed from the back of her sedan. Ethan set down his hammer without hesitation. "Let me help you," he called. She smiled with grateful eyes. "You already have enough work of your own." Ethan lifted the 50-pound bag as though the conversation had already ended. "Neighbors are part of the work," he replied. She thanked him twice before he quietly returned to his unfinished repairs. Later that evening, while driving into town for a replacement hinge, Ethan noticed a young delivery driver standing beside a disabled van with the hood raised. Cars passed without slowing. Ethan pulled over anyway. Together, they discovered nothing more serious than a loose battery cable. 10 minutes later, the engine started, and the relieved driver reached for his wallet. Ethan gently raised a hand. "Keep it," he said. "Buy your family dinner instead." The young man stared for a moment before offering a handshake that carried more gratitude than words ever could. Darkness settled across Millbrook by the time Ethan reached the grocery store. He carried only a small basket containing bread, milk, soup, oatmeal, and one package of pancake mix because Lily loved Saturday breakfasts. At the checkout line, he noticed an elderly gentleman quietly returning a carton of eggs after realizing he did not have enough cash. Without making a scene, Ethan asked the cashier to include the eggs with his own purchase. The older man protested, embarrassed, but Ethan only smiled. "Someone helped me once," he said gently. "I am just keeping that kindness moving." It was not entirely true. Nobody had rescued him from hardship. Still, he believed kindness did not need permission from experience. When Ethan finally pulled into the farmhouse driveway beneath a sky crowded with stars, he noticed fresh tire tracks pressed into the gravel near the mailbox. They did not belong to his truck. He frowned, looking toward the empty road before carrying the groceries inside. On the kitchen table sat a mason jar filled with fresh honey and a handwritten note in careful block letters. For Lily, every home deserves something sweet before winter. There was no signature, no return address. Ethan stepped onto the porch and looked across the quiet fields glowing silver beneath the moonlight. Far beyond the old oak tree at the edge of the property, a lone pair of headlights disappeared over the distant hill. He could not see who was driving. He did not know why a stranger had chosen his home. But somewhere in the silence, unseen threads had already begun weaving together two lives that neither man yet understood. The first frost settled across Millbrook before sunrise, leaving every fence rail, every blade of grass, and every weathered rooftop covered in a thin layer of silver that sparkled beneath the early morning light. Ethan Walker was already awake long before dawn. He poured black coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, packed Lily's lunch with a peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, and homemade oatmeal cookies, then quietly buttoned her winter coat before driving her to school. "Have a wonderful day," he said as she climbed out of the truck. Lily hugged him tightly. "You too, Daddy. Do not work too hard." Ethan laughed softly. "I will do my best." After watching her disappear through the school doors, he headed toward another day of small repair jobs that barely kept the lights on. By late morning, he was replacing loose boards on a neighbor's porch when a familiar voice called from the edge of the yard. "Looks like those hands never stop moving." Ethan turned and recognized the elderly farmer from outside the bank. The man stood calmly beside an aging green pickup with faded paint and decades of honest wear. His straw hat rested low against the crisp wind, and his bright blue eyes carried the same quiet patience Ethan remembered. "Good morning," Ethan said warmly. "I do not believe we have properly met." The old farmer smiled. "Samuel Brooks." Ethan wiped his hand on his work jeans before shaking his. "Ethan Walker. Nice to meet you." Samuel nodded toward the porch. "You do fine work." Ethan shrugged. "I simply try to leave things better than I found them." The answer seemed to linger in Samuel's thoughts longer than expected. After a moment, he reached into his truck and removed a small wooden toolbox polished smooth by years of use. My fence gave up on me yesterday. Think you might have an hour this afternoon. Ethan glanced at the unfinished porch. As soon as I finish here. Samuel smiled with quiet satisfaction. I was hoping you would say that. The Brooks farm rested several miles outside town, surrounded by rolling fields that had already been harvested for the season. Weathered barns stood proudly against the open sky, their faded red paint telling stories that no history book could preserve. Ethan admired the property as they walked toward a broken section of split-rail fence stretching nearly 30 feet across a shallow pasture. This should not take long, Ethan said, setting down his tools. Samuel leaned against a fence post. No rush. As Ethan worked, replacing cracked rails and reinforcing weak posts, Samuel asked simple questions. How long had Ethan lived in Millbrook? What kind of work did he enjoy most? What was Lily like? The questions never felt intrusive. They felt like conversations that had been waiting years to happen. Ethan answered honestly without complaint. He spoke proudly about Lily's love of books, about her habit of collecting smooth stones from every creek they visited, and about the little vegetable garden she insisted on planting every spring even when the harvest was small. He never mentioned the bank or the loan. Samuel noticed that absence more than any confession. Hours later the fence stood straight again. Ethan gathered his tools while Samuel reached into his coat pocket and removed several folded bills. Ethan immediately shook his head. Please do not. It was only a few hours of work. Samuel looked directly into his eyes. Everyone deserves to be paid for honest labor. Ethan smiled gently. Maybe, but sometimes neighbors simply help neighbors. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and drying hay across the fields while a distant windmill turned slowly against the afternoon sky. Finally, Samuel returned the money to his pocket. Then have supper with me instead. Ethan hesitated. I should get home before Lily finishes her homework. Samuel chuckled softly. Bring her next time. Ethan thanked him and climbed into his truck. As he drove away, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. Samuel remained standing beside the repaired fence, not admiring the craftsmanship, but watching the old pickup disappear down the gravel road. There was a quiet certainty in the farmer's expression, as though every answer he had been searching for was slowly revealing itself not through grand achievements or impressive words, but through the ordinary choices of a father who continued to give even when life had given him so very little. The following Saturday arrived beneath a sky washed clean by overnight rain, leaving the countryside wrapped in the rich scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Ethan Walker spent the morning stacking firewood beside the farmhouse while Lily bundled smaller pieces into neat little piles that she proudly declared were perfectly organized. Every few minutes she paused to admire a bright red cardinal perched on the fence, convinced the bird had come to inspect her work. Ethan smiled each time she waved at it. Moments like these reminded him that happiness rarely depended on money. It depended on having someone worth coming home to. Just before noon, an old green pickup rolled slowly into the driveway, its familiar engine rumbling softly before coming to a stop beside the weathered barn. Samuel Brooks stepped out carrying 2 paper sacks filled with fresh apples, homemade bread, and a jar of blackberry preserves. Lily hurried forward with the fearless curiosity only children possess. Are you the farmer Daddy helped? She asked. Samuel's eyes brightened with genuine warmth. I believe I am. Lily accepted the jar carefully with both hands. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Samuel smiled. You have very good manners. Ethan walked over, slightly surprised. You did not have to bring anything. Samuel looked toward the farmhouse. An old man should never arrive at someone else's home empty-handed. They shared lunch around the small wooden kitchen table that Ethan had built years earlier from reclaimed oak boards. Nothing about the meal was extravagant. Vegetable soup simmered on the stove, fresh bread filled the room with warmth, and Lily happily spread the blackberry preserves onto thick slices while telling Samuel every detail about her third-grade classroom, her favorite library books, and the stray orange cat that occasionally visited the porch. Samuel listened with complete attention, laughing softly at her stories and asking thoughtful questions that made her feel important. Ethan noticed something unusual. The old farmer never interrupted anyone. He never hurried a conversation. He treated every answer as though it deserved to be heard completely. After lunch, Samuel asked if Ethan would walk with him to the back pasture. They crossed the property slowly beneath towering oak trees whose remaining leaves drifted gently onto the grass. At the edge of the field stood the old windmill that had not turned properly in years. Its blades creaked quietly whenever the breeze caught them. Samuel rested one hand against the weathered wooden fence and looked across the open land. "Tell me something," he said after a long silence. "If everything worked out exactly the way you hoped, what would your life look like 5 years from now?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He studied the empty pasture, the aging barn, and the farmhouse standing quietly behind them. "People think I want money," he finally said. "They are wrong. I want stability. I want Lily to finish school without worrying whether we will have to move again. I want this old place to stand long enough for her to bring her own family here someday. I want to earn what we have instead of fearing what we might lose." Samuel nodded slowly. "Nothing for yourself?" Ethan laughed quietly. "That already is for me." The answer lingered in the cool afternoon air. Samuel bent down, picked up a handful of dark Iowa soil, and let it slip gently through his fingers. "Good land always remembers the people who care for it," he said almost to himself. Ethan looked at him with quiet curiosity, unsure whether the farmer was speaking about crops or something much deeper. As the sun settled lower across the fields, Samuel reached into his coat pocket and unfolded an old photograph whose edges had softened with age. Ethan caught only a brief glimpse before Samuel carefully returned it to his pocket. It showed a smiling young man standing beside a pickup truck that looked remarkably similar to Ethan's. Samuel noticed Ethan's glance, but offered no explanation. Instead, he smiled gently and said, "Sometimes life gives us another chance through someone we never expected to meet." Ethan did not fully understand the words, yet for the first time in many months, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over the little farmhouse, as though hope itself had quietly found the road back home. Several days passed, and the rhythm of late autumn settled gently over Millbrook. Every morning Ethan Walker rose before the sun. Every evening he returned home with tired hands and the quiet satisfaction of another honest day's work. Bills still waited on the kitchen counter. The overdue tax notice still rested inside the blue folder he had hidden in a cabinet above the refrigerator. Yet he refused to let worry become the loudest voice inside his home. Lily still laughed whenever pancakes came out shaped like uneven hearts. She still left tiny drawings inside his lunchbox with messages that simply read, "You are the best, Daddy." Those little notes somehow carried more strength than any paycheck. One crisp afternoon, Samuel Brooks appeared once again, this time asking if Ethan could help inspect an abandoned piece of farmland a few miles beyond his own property. "It has not been worked in years," Samuel explained as they drove along a narrow gravel road bordered by bare oak trees. "Most folks say it is finished." Ethan looked out the passenger window as rolling hills opened before them. The neglected farm came into view behind a rusted entrance gate leaning awkwardly on one hinge. Tall weeds covered what had once been productive fields. Sections of fencing had collapsed into the grass. The old farmhouse stood quietly against the gray sky with broken shutters and a sagging porch. Even the weathered red barn seemed to lean under the weight of forgotten seasons. Samuel shut off the truck and remained silent for several moments before speaking. "Tell me what you see." Ethan climbed out slowly and walked across the uneven ground. He knelt beside the soil, scooping a handful into his palm before rubbing it gently between his fingers. He studied the slope of the land, the drainage ditch, the remaining fruit trees standing near the fence line, and the sturdy stone foundation beneath the old barn. Finally, he returned to Samuel with a thoughtful smile. "I see a great deal of work," he admitted. Samuel chuckled. "Everyone says that." Ethan looked back toward the fields glowing softly beneath the afternoon light. "But I also see healthy soil that has simply been neglected. I see buildings that need repairs instead of replacement. I see apple trees that were planted by someone who expected grandchildren to enjoy them one day. I see a place that somebody loved enough to build carefully." Samuel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Most people only notice what is broken." Ethan shrugged gently. "Broken things are not always finished. Sometimes they are only waiting for someone willing to care for them again." The old farmer lowered his eyes, hiding emotions that quietly stirred beneath years of practiced composure. They walked together toward the weathered porch where two old rocking chairs still faced the fields. One chair creaked gently in the breeze. Samuel rested a hand on its worn wooden arm. "If this place belonged to you," he asked softly, "what would you do first?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I would repair the roof before winter. Fix the well. Rebuild the fences one section at a time. Plant cover crops in the spring. Nothing fancy, just steady work." Samuel nodded. "And if you discovered halfway through that it would take more years than you expected?" Ethan smiled with the calm confidence of a man who had already survived harder things than unfinished projects. "Then I would keep working. Good things usually grow slower than people hope." The breeze carried the scent of dry leaves across the empty pasture, while a flock of geese crossed the wide Iowa sky overhead. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Samuel reached into his coat pocket, removed an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag, and turned it slowly between his weathered fingers. He stared at it with quiet affection before closing his hand around it once more. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You answered every question I needed answered today." Ethan looked puzzled. "I'm not sure I answered much of anything." Samuel smiled with the peaceful certainty of someone who had just found exactly what he had been searching for. "Sometimes," he said quietly as they walked back toward the truck, "a man's character is revealed long before he realizes anyone has been listening." Winter announced its arrival with a quiet determination that seemed to settle over every acre of Millbrook. Frost clung to fence posts each morning, and the wind carried a sharper edge that reminded every farmer another season had come and gone. Ethan Walker noticed something else had changed as well. Nearly 2 weeks had passed, and Samuel Brooks had not appeared once. At first, Ethan assumed the elderly farmer had simply become busy, preparing for winter. Then another week slipped by. The old green pickup never rolled past the farmhouse. No handwritten note appeared beside the mailbox. No unexpected invitation arrived. The silence felt unusual because Samuel had become part of the gentle rhythm of their lives without either of them realizing it. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan loaded Lily into the truck and drove toward the Brooks farm with a basket filled with homemade chicken soup, fresh bread, and a jar of blackberry preserves. Lily insisted they return. "Maybe Mr. Brooks caught a cold," she said as she looked out the window. "Grandpa Wilson at school says older people have to be extra careful in winter." Ethan smiled. "That is exactly why we are checking on him." The gravel road leading to the farm looked untouched. Fallen leaves rested undisturbed across the driveway, and the familiar pickup was nowhere in sight. The farmhouse stood quietly beneath a pale sky, its curtains drawn, its porch empty. Ethan knocked gently on the front door and waited. No footsteps answered. He knocked again, this time a little louder. Still nothing. Lily looked up at him with worried eyes. "Do you think he is okay?" Ethan glanced toward the barn and the fields stretching beyond it. Everything felt strangely still. Just as he considered leaving the basket on the porch, a neighboring rancher pulled into the driveway with several bags of livestock feed in the back of his truck. He rolled down his window. "You looking for Sam?" Ethan nodded. "We have not seen him in a while." The rancher's expression grew solemn. "He was taken to St. Margaret Medical Center about 10 days ago. Heart trouble, from what I heard. Nobody knows much more than that." Ethan felt a quiet heaviness settle inside him. "Thank you for telling us." The man tipped his hat before driving away, leaving only the sound of tires crunching across frozen gravel. Lily gently placed the basket beside the front door. She tucked a folded drawing underneath the cloth covering the soup. Ethan noticed colorful crayon pictures of the farmhouse, the old windmill, and Samuel standing beside them, all with an enormous smile. Above the drawing she had written, carefully in large, uneven letters, "Please get well soon. We miss you." Ethan swallowed quietly before they climbed back into the truck. On the drive home, neither of them spoke very much. The countryside seemed quieter than usual, as though even the fields were waiting. Days turned into another week. Ethan considered visiting the hospital several times, but he hesitated. Samuel had always been a private man, and Ethan did not wish to intrude if family members surrounded him. Instead, he continued caring for his own responsibilities, repairing barns, shoveling sidewalks after snowstorms, and making certain Lily never sensed how uncertain their own future remained. Then, on a gray Monday morning, as Ethan was replacing broken shingles on the roof of a local church, a dark sedan slowly pulled into the parking lot below. A well-dressed woman stepped out carrying a leather briefcase and looked toward him. "Excuse me," she called. "Are you Mr. Ethan Walker?" Ethan climbed carefully down the ladder, brushing snow from his work gloves. Yes, I am. The woman extended a business card with calm professionalism. My name is Rebecca Collins. I am an attorney. Ethan accepted the card, confused. Is something wrong? Rebecca paused for only a moment before answering. I represent Mr. Samuel Brooks. He specifically requested that I find you as soon as possible. Ethan's heart began to race, not from fear, but from the quiet certainty that whatever came next would forever change the meaning of every conversation he had shared with the old farmer who had always seemed to ask simple questions while searching for something far greater than simple answers. Rebecca Collins waited until Ethan had gathered his tools before leading him to the quiet warmth of a small law office overlooking Millbrook's historic courthouse square. Snow drifted gently outside the tall windows, softening the sounds of passing traffic until the entire town seemed wrapped in respectful silence. Ethan removed his work gloves, still uncertain why he had been called. Rebecca placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him before opening a thick leather folder embossed with Samuel Brooks's initials. Her expression was kind but measured, the expression of someone who understood that certain conversations permanently divided life into before and after. Mr. Walker, she began gently, I am very sorry to tell you that Samuel Brooks passed away 3 days ago. Ethan lowered his eyes without speaking. The words settled heavily in the room. He remembered the old farmer standing beside broken fences, sharing soup at the kitchen table, smiling as Lily described her school projects, and quietly asking questions that had never seemed important until now. Rebecca allowed the silence to breathe before continuing. He spoke about you often during his final days. In fact, your name appears throughout his estate documents. Ethan looked up in surprise. There must be some mistake. We only knew each other for a short time. Rebecca slowly shook her head. According to Mr. Brooks, the amount of time never mattered. Character did. She carefully removed a folded document and placed it before him. This is his final will. Ethan stared at the page as Rebecca read each provision with calm precision. Samuel had left his farmhouse, every acre of cultivated land, the barns, the tractors, the equipment, the livestock contracts, and every associated farming right to Ethan Walker, effective immediately upon the completion of probate. Ethan blinked several times, convinced he had misunderstood. No, he whispered. That cannot be right. Rebecca slid the signed document closer. It is entirely correct. Ethan leaned back in disbelief. He has family. Someone else should inherit all of this. Rebecca folded her hands. Samuel had no surviving spouse. His wife passed away many years ago. His only son died before him. There are distant relatives, but none were named as beneficiaries. Samuel made this decision personally, willingly, and with complete legal capacity. Ethan looked toward the snow-covered courthouse outside the window, searching for words that refused to come. I did not earn any of this. Rebecca smiled softly. Samuel believed you already had. She opened another envelope sealed with dark blue wax. He left something else. He instructed me to give this to you only. After the will had been explained, Ethan accepted the envelope carefully. Across the front, written in firm but aging handwriting, appeared only 4 words. For Ethan and Lily. His hands trembled slightly as he turned it over. Before opening it, he looked at Rebecca once more. Why would he trust me with everything he spent a lifetime building? Rebecca's eyes reflected quiet admiration. Because while everyone else measured success by acreage, savings, or titles, Samuel measured people by what they did when nobody expected a reward. Ethan lowered his gaze to the envelope again. Every conversation returned to him with startling clarity. The broken fence, the abandoned farm, the questions about the future, the offer of payment he had refused, the old photograph Samuel had hidden in his pocket. None of those moments had been casual. They had all been pieces of something much larger. Rebecca stood and walked toward the window, giving Ethan the privacy to collect himself. Outside, church bells echoed gently across the town square as light snow continued falling over quiet streets and weathered rooftops. Ethan rested the envelope against his chest for a long moment before carefully breaking the seal. Whatever Samuel had chosen to write inside would not simply explain an inheritance. It would reveal the reason an elderly farmer had recognized something in an ordinary single father long before Ethan had ever seen it in himself. Inside the envelope rested 3 handwritten pages folded with careful precision, and one faded photograph whose edges had grown soft with time. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the same picture he had briefly seen in Samuel's hand weeks earlier beside the old windmill. A young man stood smiling next to an aging pickup truck, his arm wrapped around a little girl no older than Lily. Their expressions carried the quiet confidence of people who believe tomorrow would always arrive. Ethan unfolded the first page and began to read. Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then my journey has ended, but yours is only beginning. You once told me that broken things are not always finished. I never told you that those words rescued an old man who had quietly stopped believing them. Ethan paused, his vision blurring as he continued. The young man in the photograph is my son, Daniel. He was a devoted father, an honest worker, and the kind of man who believed every problem could be solved with enough patience and enough love. When illness took him from this world, it also took away the future I had imagined for our family. After that day, I kept farming because I knew nothing else, but every sunrise felt smaller than the one before it. I watched neighbors chase larger harvests while I quietly waited for the seasons to pass. Then one morning outside the bank, I saw a father walk through those glass doors carrying hope inside a blue folder. I watched him walk back out carrying disappointment without bitterness. You thanked the woman who had just told you no. Most people leave anger behind them. You left dignity. Ethan lowered the page for a moment, remembering that cold morning with startling clarity before continuing. I wondered whether that quiet strength had been an accident, so I watched. I watched you help an elderly neighbor without expecting payment. I watched you repair a stranger's vehicle and refuse money that your own family desperately needed. I watched you speak to your daughter with patience instead of frustration. I watched you notice people others overlooked. Every answer I searched for came from your ordinary days, not your extraordinary ones. Character is never proven when life is easy. It reveals itself when life offers every excuse to become someone else. Ethan turned to the final page, his hands trembling gently. You believed I was testing your skills. I was not. Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot. The abandoned farm I showed you was never about the land. It was about whether you still saw possibility where everyone else saw failure. You did. Not because you expected ownership, but because hope had become part of who you are. That is why I leave everything to you. I am not giving you a reward. I am entrusting you with a promise. Care for this land the way you care for your daughter. Let the fields remind her that faithful work grows slowly but lasts for generations. Open your table to lonely neighbors. Help young families who believe they have run out of chances. Let no child who visits that farmhouse ever doubt they are welcome. If people someday praise my generosity, gently correct them. Tell them an old farmer simply recognized the harvest already growing inside another man's heart. Ethan carefully folded the pages together, unable to speak. Rebecca remained quietly by the window until he finally looked up. Tears rested in his eyes, not from the weight of the inheritance, but from the responsibility resting inside Samuel's final words. Rebecca smiled softly. He hoped you would understand. Ethan nodded slowly. I do now. Outside, the snow had stopped. Sunlight slipped through the winter clouds, covering the courthouse square with a warm golden glow that reflected from rooftops and church windows alike. For the first time since leaving the bank weeks earlier, Ethan realized that Samuel had never truly changed his future with land, buildings, or equipment. He had changed it by seeing the value in a man who had almost forgotten it himself. 3 years passed with the quiet certainty of changing seasons. Spring returned to the valley exactly as Samuel Brooks had promised it always would. The neglected fields slowly transformed into rows of healthy corn, soybeans, and wildflowers planted along every fence line because Lily insisted beauty deserved its own place beside hard work. The old farmhouse stood stronger than ever beneath a fresh coat of white paint, its porch rebuilt by Ethan Walker with the same patient hands that had once struggled to keep a single roof from collapsing. The weathered barn no longer leaned against time. It welcomed neighbors during harvest festivals, school field trips, and community dinners where no one was asked whether they could afford a meal before taking a seat. Samuel's rocking chair remained on the front porch exactly where he had left it. Ethan refused to move it. Every morning before beginning work, he would glance toward the empty chair and quietly whisper, "We are taking good care of it." Lily, now 11 years old, had grown into a thoughtful young girl whose kindness seemed to spread as naturally as sunshine across an open field. She knew every neighbor by name. She carried baskets of vegetables to elderly families without being asked. She still left handwritten notes inside her father's lunchbox, although now they often included little reminders from Samuel's letter. One read, "Hope grows slowly, but it always grows." Ethan kept every note inside the same blue folder that had once held the loan application the bank had rejected. The folder no longer represented failure. It reminded him that some doors closed only because another path needed room to appear. The Brooks family farm became known throughout the county not for its size, but for its spirit. Young farmers borrowed equipment without paying rental fees during difficult seasons. Widowed neighbors received firewood before the first snowfall each winter. Every Thanksgiving, the farmhouse table stretched farther across the dining room as folding tables welcomed anyone with nowhere else to celebrate. Nobody left hungry. Nobody left unnoticed. One bright October afternoon, Ethan drove into town to purchase supplies. As he passed Prairie State Bank, he noticed a young father sitting alone on the same wooden bench where Samuel had once quietly watched him. The man's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of disappointment. A worn envelope rested loosely in his hands while a little boy beside him stared silently at the sidewalk, kicking fallen leaves with tired shoes. Ethan recognized the look immediately because he had once worn it himself. He parked across the street, walked over, and sat beside the stranger without saying a word. After several moments, the young father sighed. "They said no." Ethan nodded gently. "They said no to me once too." The man looked surprised. "Then how did you make it?" Ethan smiled, not toward the bank, but toward the quiet streets of Millbrook glowing beneath the afternoon sun. "Someone believed in my character before I believed in my future." He reached into his truck and returned carrying an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag. Samuel had left it with the farm, and Ethan had carried it ever since. He placed it carefully into the young father's hand. "There is a guest cottage on my property that has been empty since we finished restoring it. Stay there as long as your family needs. We have work if you are willing to work. We have meals if you are hungry. We have room." The young father's eyes filled with grateful disbelief. Why would you trust someone you do not even know? Ethan looked toward the fields beyond town where golden harvests stretched beneath an endless Iowa sky. "Because an old farmer once taught me that the greatest investment you will ever make is not in land, money, or buildings. It is in people whose hearts are still good even after life has been hard." That evening, as the sun settled behind the rolling hills, Lily stood beside her father on the porch watching another family drive slowly up the gravel road toward a second chance. The breeze gently rocked Samuel's empty chair. Neither Ethan nor Lily spoke. They did not need to. Some prayers are answered with words. Others are answered when kindness quietly continues from one life into another. And in that peaceful silence, where gratitude replaced bitterness and hope outlived disappointment, the richest inheritance Samuel Brooks had ever left behind was never the farm itself. It was the simple courage to keep believing that dignity, grace, and second chances always produce the finest harvest.